Friends, I want to welcome you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to this message for this week. This is a little delayed because I was hoping that the outdoor worship message would come through clearly, but it didn't. Today we are continuing the sermon series of Unraveled, and we're looking today at public grief that leads into action. And our Bible story is not one of those well-known stories. It's got a lot of violence, and it makes us uncomfortable to see where the good news is in that story. And so today, as we begin, I want to speak about revenge. Most of us grew up with a saying, you don't get mad, you get even. Because we know that somehow this instinct for revenge, for getting even with people, is kind of a universal experience. I was reflecting on the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys from the 19th century and thinking that it's interesting that in every culture there's that kind of theme where you want to go and hurt those who hurt you, and you want to injure so you could feel better. But the problem with revenge is that it really doesn't work. If it works, it's only for a short period of time that you feel better. But the grief that needs to happen only gets delayed and pushed down, and it comes out even more aggressively, I would say, if we don't deal with it in healthy ways. And so today I want to invite us to consider this need for revenge or need for blaming somebody or lashing out at someone when we feel hurt, or when there's an injustice in the world and the need to remedy that with revenge. And how it doesn't work for us, and it hasn't served us throughout the centuries. And that there is an alternative path to that. And so today we look at this woman in our Bible story. Her name was Rizpah. She was one of the secondary wives of King Saul. After he died, she had two sons. After he died, she was left on her own, and the new king, King David, felt that there was something to be done to remedy the famine that was going on in the land. So the instinct is to blame somebody. Something went wrong because somebody did something wrong. And that was the instinct that the king had. And so they went and thought about the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were supposed to be protected by the Israelites when they entered the land. So this was going back to the book of Joshua, chapter 9. But Saul violated that treaty. And so in order to blame somebody for the famine, the King David, believed that, it must have been related to this blood guilt. And so he went and sought out the leaders of the Gibeonites and said, what can I do to remedy this situation so we could have food in the land? And guess what they asked for? You guessed it right, revenge. They wanted revenge. They wanted something to make them feel better. They didn't want money, they didn't want restitution, they wanted revenge. That was the instinct that they had. And so they asked for the descendants of King Saul to be killed or to brought to justice. And so what the king did, King David, took 7 of the descendants of King Saul. 2 of them were the sons of Rizpah. And he gave them to the Gibeonites, who impaled them, who killed them in a very violent way, and put their body in a public space on a hill so everybody could see it. And so again, that's how revenge works. You want to show off that your power, the anger is to be taken out in public on somebody. And so the response of Rizpah gives us hope, because instead of trying to start a war or a movement that would kill everybody, she showed grief. She was willing to go out and protest, if you will, by standing up on the hill, by being there day and night for 6 months, protecting the bodies of her 2 sons. She protected them, and she showed the whole community her deep grief. Now, what's interesting is that the king felt the pressure of this public scene. people started to talk in the community. Look at what the king has done to this poor woman, to this poor widow, to this poor lowly concubine, this secondary wife of Saul. And so he had to do something, and he did. He went and sought different bodies from different places and then put them together and buried them properly. What's interesting is that that's when God responded and the famine ended. And so Rizpah not only brought healing to her sons, their bodies, and the dignity that they needed to be afforded, but also she stopped this belief that human sacrifice was an okay thing, and that theology wasn't a good theology, that to kill somebody was to satisfy God's anger on the people. So it didn't necessarily bring back her children from the dead, so it didn't necessarily bring her back the justice in the sense that she would have had her sons back, but it stopped the king from ruling in such a horrible way to take out life, to take out people without being accountable. And so her grief, her willingness to show the depth of her pain, brought compassion. Even though we don't know if the king did it out of compassion, most likely he didn't. But the people felt such sorrow for this woman. They identified with her pain. They could see that she needed to be treated differently. That's the power of public grief, is that it connects us to our humanity. One of the illusions in life that we have is that we are separate from each other. So if I hurt you, I'm fine. But in reality, when we hurt each other, we're all hurt. We create a cycle of pain, and it impacts all of us, which is one of the lessons we're learning during this pandemic. And so by grieving publicly, by sharing where we're hurt, especially when there is injustice, we can connect to our own humanity, to the image of God in each of us. We can reconnect to the compassion we have for one another. We stop these walls of divisions from getting in the way between us, from the illusion that we can be separate. What came to my mind, of course, when I read this story is the story of another mother, a woman that lost her son in a terrible way, also to injustice, the mother of Emmett Till. And this was in 1955 when her son was killed in Mississippi after being falsely accused of offending the honor of a white woman. He was 14 years old, a boy, but he was brutally killed by two white men. And this was a time of deep racism. And so the mother, when they were able to get his body back to Chicago, she refused to just bury him quietly. She had an open casket. She had his body on display for the whole world to see the damage, the violence that was done to this poor boy. And she was there displaying her grief, showing publicly her own pain. Everybody else was advising her, don't do that. But she felt the need to share the pain. She wanted to stop this from happening to other mothers. And so it's an incredible story because this was kind of one of the key moments of the civil rights movement. The world saw the pain, and there was such deep connection and compassion that took place because of that depth of grief. Public grief can lead to incredible action. So when we are seeking justice, when we are feeling hurt, it's important for us to do the work of grief, to share it with one another. It's very hard because we feel very vulnerable, and it is hard to share our deep feelings. It's easier to lash out. It's easier to put up a wall. It's easier to say, stay out, be angry or seek revenge, all the mechanisms we use. But it's much harder to speak about our pain or to listen to somebody else's pain. We want to shut that out. And so this week, the theme is being unraveled, and by grief, by injustice, and how do we respond? And the invitation is to grieve publicly, to learn to do that effectively. The story for this week that I read for the children, but it really is for adults as well, is Tear Soup. In my experiences of grief with families, I find that to be holy ground. Of course, it's easier to do that when there is a solid loss, when someone dies. But it's much harder when the grief is about loss that's ambiguous, that's not so clearly defined by one event, but maybe a personal experience. Maybe it is a current in society. Maybe it is a broken relationship. Maybe it's a loss of a job. Whatever it is that we experience, it's important to learn to grieve and to work through that, so we're not lashing out, we're not seeking revenge, we're not seeking blame, but we're seeking the transformation that comes from people acting more justly, but also from the ability to open up our pain to the transforming power of God. And so I invite you to envision this metaphor for tear soup, a pot, if you will. What would you put in it? Putting memories, putting feelings, putting ideas, all the stuff around whatever events that are on your heart and on your mind. And learning to do that often, learning to say, when I'm hurt, I'm gonna speak about it. I'm gonna share how I'm hurt. One of my friends shared with me her insights about, when people are cruel to you, when somebody comes and says something really mean and you want to cry or you want to lash out back at them, her reaction is she goes, ouch. And she says it's so disarming because people don't expect that. People don't want to feel like they hurt somebody else. They want you to get into it with them and back and forth. But it's much harder to deal with somebody else's grief, to realize that the person is being vulnerable with you, telling you, that really hurt, that cut me to the core. It changes the dynamics in the relationship. And so I invite you this week to pray, to open your heart, to take time to think about all that's happening in the world and the need for us to grieve, the need for us to release all of this to God's care, and to think of Rizpah, and to think of her example, and to think of the cross of Jesus and the grief that comes from the loss that took place. Think of the mother of Jesus too, having to witness his death, having to grieve publicly, having to come to terms with his loss, and what that meant for her and for the community to see the need for change. And so I pray that this will speak to you about the power of grief, the power of being vulnerable. We live with this illusion that crying in public or sharing our feelings is weakness, but in reality, it is incredibly strong when we are able to hold that space for ourselves, for others, for God to work through it. So I pray this week that you will embrace this gift of our time to maybe learn to process some of the grief that you have experienced in your life. Go in peace, my friends. Amen.